So from Instagram to a nationwide movement, the culture changers are revolutionizing how churches address modern challenges. And so welcome to the set, founders Jason and Kerri Persaud, here to discuss how the need for the ministry has emerged. Welcome. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks, Bill. We're so excited to be here.
Thank you. Yeah, it's great to be here with you.
Yeah, so Kerri, Culture Changers started kind of as an Instagram movement, but now has become really a form of empowering churches to address changes that we see all around in culture, and it's changing so quickly. So how did that happen?
Yeah, well, I mean, Bill, fall of 2020, for those of you who may not remember, our culture was in a bit of upheaval. You know, the pandemic was happening, and then there was a lot going on in the world related to social justice. We had the death of George Floyd. Many of our young people were taking to the streets in protests, and the church, for the most part, was silent. And so what we were finding is the youth and young adult from our church, they were going to Instagram, other social media platforms to get their information. You know, our young people are 3 times more likely to go to social media rather than broadcast news to get their information. And at the same time, you know, only 1 in 3 Christian Canadian youth are actually reading their Bible weekly. And so how are they able to process all of perhaps the misinformation they're hearing on social media and process it in a biblical context? And so we began hosting these conversations on Instagram Lives, just about what was happening in culture, just as a way to speak into it. Felt that we needed to be where our young people were. But that has evolved because we are passionate about the local church. We both have served in local churches on staff, and we believe that the local church is God's vehicle on the earth today. And so we just really felt like we needed to move the conversation from social media into the local church context, believing that youth, young adults, if they had trusted godly leaders in their life, that they could have these conversations with. And so now we've evolved to be more of how can we equip church leaders and pastors to be able to have their own conversations with their young people to be able to move that into the local church setting.
Yeah, I love that, because I think many, maybe even some viewers, kind of see culture as bad or negative, and maybe technology. But the truth is, these are all just mechanisms and methods. And if we can leverage them for the kingdom, and like you said, it's the platform or the language that the next generation is already speaking and leaning into, how can we do that better? And so, okay, so you talk about tough topics.
We do.
So what are some of the toughest topics you've actually had to address?
Well, Bill, you know, back in 2020, we had to address racial justice.
Right.
And just dealing with that, how can we help young people specifically, but the church as well, know how to tackle this really from a biblical perspective? You know, we saw our young people, we saw many young people, especially in larger urban centers across our country, see things happening in other places like the US, what was happening, but their fuel wasn't righteous fuel. It was fueled in other things. And so seeing students follow secular media or organizations, secular influencers, we really felt that we needed to provide some context from a Jesus perspective.
Right.
How would Jesus engage these conversations and help engage to understand why it's important and why we need to do that?
Yeah, well, the verse I think of immediately is, do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good.
Yeah.
And I think the temptation and the tendency, right, is to fight evil with evil, to retaliate, to get my rights. And so I love that. Can you maybe give a couple of examples of how Culture Changers is actually impacting the church or equipping to address maybe some of the social media or social justice issues?
Yeah, you know, one of the things that we have expanded to is we started with racial justice. Okay. And now with things happening in culture, even war, students, young people, the church want to know, how do we respond to war, genocide, and all these things? What would Jesus say if he was here about that? And I think we have a good biblical perspective on how Jesus engaged culture. And so stepping into the arena, not just with that, but even sexuality and different cultural things that young people are in chaos about. We really feel like we need to provide a base biblically, not just this cultural Christianity. There's this things that is so pervasive, persuasive in the church on cultural Christianity. What about biblical Christianity? How do we form a good foundation for young people to attack these topics And even more important, I think to create conversation space for students to begin to process this. And not just students, but I even think leaders as well. I've had so many conversations, Bill, with pastors and ministry leaders across the country. And so that's opened up a space for us to do speak at conferences, to work with staff teams, to do a number of different types of things, even Sunday mornings. Bill, I'll never forget, one of the first opportunities I had was on a Sunday morning in 2021 to speak on racial justice in a church. Now, things were still very sensitive and very touchy, but I had a friend in ministry and said, I think this is good, for our church to understand, and a great way for you to begin to process helping churches do this. And so we're grateful for the opportunities that we've received from different ministries and organizations to be able to do that.
I love that. And just really quickly, I want to lean into something here because I think it's important. You talk about conversation.
Yeah.
And I think that's really important because I think we're used to one way, from a position of I'm right, you're wrong. How can our viewers, just really quickly, maybe start having these conversations on their own with maybe their children, their grandchildren?
Yeah.
Yeah, I know for me, when it comes to the topic of, racial injustice, as someone who's Caucasian,
Yeah.
has lived in Canada all my life, it was really important for me during that season to assume the position of a learner and a listener, and just to hear other people's stories. And so, finding people in my church, neighbors that I could just listen to and hear their stories to understand. And sometimes it was hard because they said things that perhaps I didn't want to hear,
Right.
because I felt like I was being lumped,
Yes.
right, in a certain group, but I needed to humble myself. And so I think for those of us who are more mature, we need to assume a posture of humility. And just open our ears and our hearts, and then allow the young people that we're in conversation with to express what they're thinking, even though everything inside of me screams, that's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. I've learned that I have to just close my mouth, and I just sometimes have to allow them to process. And then after they've spoken, then, I can interject, but I need to do it from a position of, I hear you. I may not agree with what you're saying, but I hear you and I'm trying to understand. And so those are some of the things that I know that I had to do.
I love that. Well, we're going to hear more in just a few moments. We'll be right back. Well, we are back with Jason and Kerri Persaud, culture changers. And I want to pick up where we left off because there's something really important about what you said, Kerri, about learning, and how we can learn. Because I think we forget that when we were young, we had to deconstruct our own worldview too, and we needed safe places. And I don't know if social media is that safe, right?
Yeah.
So how are you helping maybe pastors or those who are older? How are you equipping them to navigate that?
Yeah, Bill, there's a couple different things that we're doing in our ministry to do that. I really think research is a great place to start. To help us form a case. And in that sense, World Vision did a study that they released last year, and they shared the top 5 things that are on young people's hearts. It's interesting. Mental health was number 1.
Yes.
Climate change was number 2. Racial justice was number 3, and then poverty. And I can't remember the 5th at the moment. And so understanding that, but what was interesting in that research was that 47% of young people globally said that they want a religious leader or a Christian leader to lead in that conversation. So I think, hearing and understanding the questions and the need and the burdens that young people specifically and people in the world that are caring, we've got to be able to address that. So I think that's a good place to start. And then from a biblical foundation, I think we need to understand that justice is very dear to God's heart.
100%.
We look from all the way to Genesis, all the way to Revelation, and there is this thread and this connection of, loving your neighbor as yourself, doing right to others. And there's so many different scriptures that talk about speaking up for those that are oppressed, for those that are downtrodden, and rescuing them. And we have a responsibility to do that. And so I think steering people to God's heart is really the first place.
I love that because I think, and you tell me if I'm right on this or if I'm on the right track. I just think every human being needs a cause, a reason to get up in the morning. And the challenge is sometimes the church hasn't given a compelling cause, even though we have the most compelling cause. And so they're giving their time and their attention and their energy to causes that we know maybe aren't as beneficial
Yeah.
to them as individuals or to society as a whole. So how can we as the church do a better job, if we're going to change culture,
Yeah.
by building a cause that's worthy of giving our life for?
Yeah. If I can just talk about Jesus for just one moment,
I'd love that.
because I think he has to be the center of everything. In Matthew chapter 15 and Mark chapter 7, there's this story of this Syrophoenician woman that Jesus called a dog. And it's an interesting story because in the first 20 verses of Matthew 15, Jesus is talking about inner purity. The religious leaders come to him and they question him why his disciples aren't washing their hands. And in essence, Jesus says, he says, it's not what goes into a man that makes him unclean, it's what comes out of a man. And then he takes his young disciples on like this 50-kilometer journey north from where they were in Galilee to Tyre and Sidon. And he teaches them. He has this encounter with this woman where he ignores her. He says, that he's only come for the children of Israel. And, and this incredible dialogue that I don't have time to get into, but he teaches this lesson that he was crossing racial, gender, cultural, ethnic, and religious barriers all in one story. And I think we have to look at Jesus and how he lived his life and how he demonstrated what it meant or means to love people and to get out of a place of comfort and cross some areas that are a little messy. I think Jesus did a good job on that.
Yeah, and he did remind us that it might even cost us our life.
Absolutely.
But it's worth it. And I think this generation is looking for something worthy of their life. I think that's where hopelessness comes, right? When you don't feel that way. Okay, so you recently started a new project called Urban Leadership Network. So can you just really briefly tell me a little bit about that?
Yes, I mean, as we've been going into churches, talking with pastors and ministry leaders and working with, staff teams, we're seeing coming out of the pandemic that a lot of these teams feel disconnected, perhaps under-resourced, overwhelmed, especially in our large urban centers. We have a lot of smaller churches. Many of them may be like an ethnic church focused around a certain language group or a certain cultural group. And so how do we help connect together? And so it's not a denomination, it's not a credentialing organization. It really is just designed to, okay, you're doing something that's great. How do we partner together to see God's kingdom move forward, especially in urban centers? And so we know we've set up different hubs where on different topics, leaders can gather and interact, share information, best practices, and really just connect relationally. That's really what it's about.
Yeah.
Well, you know what I love most about that is I just think actually if you want to change culture, you got to do it through community.
Yeah.
No one individual can do it. And so we have to do it together. So really, we just have a few moments left together.
Yeah.
One thing you want our viewers to walk away from this interview knowing or thinking or feeling?
Yeah, I think more than anything, how can we continue to model Jesus in our world? And how can we engage in conversations that maybe our perspectives aren't, in agreement with them, but still love people where they're at and just love people and bring them into the kingdom?
And, I'm reminded of Jesus' words where he said to his disciples, upon this rock, I will build my church and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. And so even though there may be chaos in our culture, God still has a plan. Jesus is still the hope of the world, and the local church is his vehicle on the earth, and we will make it.
I love that. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I'm encouraged, inspired. There is hope, and hope has a name. His name is Jesus. Well, for more information on the Culture Changers, visit 700club.ca.